We'll do it in the next decade. We'll do it in this decade, actually. This is the decade of opportunity. I was saying that we've no Ardèche, we've no party conference this year, Owen, sadly, but the last time we met was November 2019, and I set it out there in my speech to our party delegates. And I believe that we can have our referendum, win it and win it well in the course of this decade. And it's my job as the leader of Sinn Féin, with my colleagues and with wider society, to navigate us to that certain and safe shore.
Wow. United Ireland within a decade. That's big. You hit it here, everyone. Well, hello. What an honour.
Well, hello, Owen Jones. How are you? You and I have not spoken for a while.
I think we do an interview once a year, and each year things get progressively worse, if we're going to be honest. I'm not saying that's to do with our interviews, but...
Yeah, well, I think the quality of our interviews, in fairness, is probably getting better. As to the kind of political environment and the quality of the discourse, well, I think that's kind of a mixed bag, isn't it?
Yeah, I think definitely more mixed here than over there, to be honest with you. Here it's mixed, but not in a good way in any sense. I'm sure we'll come on to that. Let's start. 2020. How would you, because 2020 has been a whirlwind for you, but it's also been the worst year humanity's as a whole faced since World War II. So what's your general take on 2020 before I ask some questions?
Well, you know what? I think that there will be very few tears shed for the passing of 2020. What a year. Who could have forecast this time last year what the world would go through, as you say, Owen, a global pandemic, all of the economic disruption that has caused, the social displacement and disruption, and a huge amount of suffering, human suffering. So it's been rough. It's been really rough for some families who have been bereaved in the most heartbreaking of circumstances, bereaved in circumstances where you couldn't even grieve your dead in the normal way. It's been a hard year for people who have lost work, lost their jobs, lost income. But I think maybe most tragically this year has been really, really hard for people who may have lost heart, people who feel now more isolated, maybe more disadvantaged, and more concerned that actually, society and the world cannot change in a way that makes their lives better. So that's the kind of the negative side of the ledger. And God, the news, however, belatedly in 2020, that there's some sign of vaccines and the distribution of vaccines at least offers some glimmer of hope at the end of the tunnel. But you know me, I am always a glass half full kind of person. I believe, like for activists, for those of us who want to change things, who want a better and a fairer society, you have to reach for your optimistic, self. No matter how deeply, you have to go looking for that. So, but yeah, it's been a really, really hard year for people.
In terms of the pandemic, I mean, the British response could barely have been worse. We've got the worst death toll in Europe. Excess deaths now, we're looking at about 80,000 people, but official 60,000. If I was doing a comparison, see what you think about this. If we're looking at deaths per million, Britain's actually about twice as bad as Ireland. So would it be fair to say, well, actually, despite the horror, obviously, all deaths, absolutely horrific. You've had over 2,000 deaths in Ireland, obviously a smaller population, but nonetheless. Is it the case that you would congratulate the Irish government, obviously you're the main opposition party in Ireland, on their handling, or is it a bit more complicated than that?
Well, I mean, in as much as the Irish government and authorities had the good sense to listen to the advice of the experts at a European and a global level, particularly the World Health Organization, yes, of course, congratulations is always due for those that follow a pathway of rationality, good sense and good advice. And I mean, the approach by the Tory government initially to hang their hat on herd immunity in a kind of a laissez-faire approach was really, really dangerous. And And of course, it had a direct implication for us on this island for two reasons: because of our proximity, you are our next door neighbours, but also because in the north of Ireland, in 6 of our counties, the British still have jurisdiction. And we were really, really concerned that our unionist colleagues were looking to London, looking to Boris, looking to this strategy that was just really dangerous when you're dealing with a novel virus that was, you know, a killer virus. So that was not a good start. I mean, certainly in the north of Ireland, things came around eventually. And although we don't have anything like the kind of synergy that we require across the island to really get ahead and stay ahead of this virus, at a minimum, we managed to blunt the worst excesses of that Tory approach. And then I think as the story unfolded, I think the government in London itself reorientated its approach. And to be honest with you, Owen, you know, when we look, you know, proportionally or in ratios or statistics around death rates and so on, I mean, I'm reluctant to give anyone or any of us a clap on the back in circumstances like that. I mean, on the one hand, for any government, any administration, when you're faced with a pandemic, something as unprecedented in our lifetimes as this, that's a big challenge. And secondly, you know, for people who have suffered, who have been bereaved, who've been sick, who've lost work, like it's no good to them or no use to them for us to kind of engage in any kind of finger pointing or say we did it better than you. The truth is that our government here in Dublin didn't get it 100% right either. In Belfast, it was a mixed bag too. But it would be, I suppose, fair to say that initially the kind of the Boris Johnson view of this virus and the approach was, you know, was reckless. I mean, I thought it was crackers. But they refined that position and they moved back from it. I hope the endeavours in the distribution of the vaccine are much more successful much earlier on. That'll be great news all round.
The British government's just announced that there'll be no public inquiry as things stand into the murder of the Belfast solicitor, Pat Finucane, of course, murdered back in 1989. Even the former leader of the Conservative and Unionist Party, David Cameron, spoke of shocking levels of collusion between the British state and loyalist paramilitaries. So, firstly, what's your response to the government's refusal to have a public inquiry? And secondly, how great do you think the scale was between the British state and loyalist paramilitaries, and what does that say? How damning an indictment is that, and the failure to come to terms with it?
Well, look, I mean, the story of collusion, the story of that relationship between the British state and loyalist paramilitaries and combatants is probably the untold story of the conflict here in Ireland. And I can assure you that Pat Finucane was not the only victim of British state collusion, although he is arguably the most high-profile victim. Pat was a solicitor. He represented Republican clients, but loyalists as well. He was extremely effective, particularly in the system of diplock courts, which is, as you know, are juryless courts. He got mentioned by Douglas Hogg in the House of Commons a matter of weeks before he was assassinated in February 1989. And as you have recalled, Owen, he was assassinated in his family home in the presence of his wife and his 3 young children. And the reason why the British state has resisted again and again the need for a public inquiry into Pat's killing is because it tells the story in maybe the most dramatic way of the extent and the level of state collusion with loyalist paramilitaries. And there is a belief that the planning of Pat's killing was not just a matter of British intelligence or secret services, but that in fact it went to the very, very top of British politics. So, I mean, back in 2001 at Weston Park, an agreement was struck between the Irish government and the British government around a number of contentious killings, one of which was Pat Finucane. And in 2001, it was agreed that a public inquiry would happen, but that, they appointed then Judge Corrie, if you recall, a very eminent justice from Canada. Judge Corrie went off, did his work, made his assessment, and came back and said, yes, that Pat Finucane, there must be a public inquiry. There were to be public inquiries into other killings, by the way, as well, including the killings of two RUC, two police officers. And the Dublin government had to hold that inquiry, and they did, and that inquiry has reported. But on the question of Pat Finucane, the answer is consistently no from the British establishment. So what this tells you is that there is a very powerful set of people within the British establishment for whom the telling of the story of Pat Finucane is unconscionable. It also tells you that the British state is very anxious that the story of their dirty war here on this island is not told, and they have held to that. And do you know what? He asked me for my reaction to last week to Brandon Lewis's decision and the British government decision. I mean, I, like people, not just in Ireland, but internationally, were angry again. Were we shocked? Maybe not, but angry nonetheless. But what really I found most incredibly, he said to the Finucane family, look, we're not having a public inquiry. We're going to leave it to the police and the ombudsman in the north of Ireland to look at these matters. The police, by the way, came out shortly afterwards, the chief constable, to say, well, sure, we have no new line of inquiry. Like, there's nothing actively happening within the police or the ombudsman. So that was an absolute red herring. But the extraordinary thing was that Brandon Lewis actually said to Geraldine Finucane, to Pat's widow, look, I'm not ruling out a public inquiry sometime in the future. Now think about it. Pat was murdered more than 30 years ago. The agreement to a public inquiry goes back almost 20 years. And you have Brandon Lewis saying to this family, no, well, hold on, we might do it, but just not now. I mean, it's disgraceful, really, on every level. And the real problem with it is ultimately for an island that needs to heal itself and for people that need to be reconciled. Part of that is dealing with the past. We can't undo the damage, the hurt, but we can certainly address the division that has fostered. And for that to happen, you have to have the truth, not just about Republican, combatants, the IRA or the loyalists, or although all of that is, of course, part of the story. But crucial and central to all of this is the role of the British state. And they can run, they can hide. Brandon Lewis can frustrate things as his predecessors have. But the story of Pat Finucane has to be told, and eventually will be told. But it's just quite something that they have put the family through this. It's in a line of dishonourable acts and decisions. This is right up there as the most dishonourable.
And of course, Pat Finucane's son, John, is a Sinn Féin MP up in Belfast North and has written an article for The Guardian. Very, obviously, an extremely emotional thing for him to write about, but he wrote how they were round the dinner table in the kitchen of our home in Belfast. I was 8 years old. I sat with my mother, my sister and brother, and suddenly ended up squeezed into a corner as the gunmen fired shot after shot into the prone figure of my father. He was 39 years old when he died. Just unimaginable horror for him to have to witness at such a young age with his father. And by the way, Owen, just on that subject, and John, if he was here, would make the same point, just so as no one has the wrong end of the stick. This isn't about either special treatment for the Finucanes or, the Finucanes, as against any other victim or their family, not at all. But what makes the Finucane story so exceptional is that in perhaps the most dramatic way, it lays bare the fact of collusion by the British state with loyalist paramilitaries and murder gangs in the course of what was
a very, very vicious war here in Ireland. So any pretense that the British state was kind of a bystander, or, you know, was holding the ring between warring factions, you know, is just not true. The fact is that they were active participants in that war.
Brexit. How could we avoid talking about Brexit? The only good thing about 2020 is it seemed like maybe we just wouldn't talk about Brexit anymore. But here we are. When Boris Johnson negotiated his deal with the EU, did part of you think, well, actually, this is going to bring a united Ireland closer? He threw the DUP into the Irish Sea, customs border between the two islands. Theresa May herself said no British government could ever agree to this. The Conservatives and Unionists are helping to deliver the united Ireland that your party exists to fight for.
Well, look, I think Boris Johnson just had to bow to the logic of geography and politics in the decision that he made. It certainly was a far cry from what Theresa May had said in terms of a border in the Irish Sea. But just remember that whatever way Brexit finally lands, it's not going to be good news for us in Ireland. And I respectfully suggest that it's not great news for people in England, you know, or across Britain. I would have thought, I mean, I wouldn't fancy the idea of a deregulated Tory run paradise where everything, all regulation and standards are up for grabs. And I say that, as you know, Owen, as somebody who would be very critical of the European project and the manner in which it has lost its way, that is beyond question. But the answer to that was never a Tory Brexit, and isn't a Tory Brexit so far as we're concerned. People in the north of Ireland voted to remain. And the idea of the North being coerced out of the European Union against the expressed will of people is absolutely unacceptable. But that's where it's at. And as you say, so long as our island is partitioned, and it has been now for almost 100 years, so long as the occupant of number 10 Downing Street in Westminster has a say in Irish affairs and decisions that affect us here on this island, well, then we have a problem. But I suppose the other reality is that Brexit has put Irish unity front and centre as a discussion. And the border on the island, you see, is now not just an Irish problem, it's now a European problem for all sorts of reasons. And I think the prospect of Irish unity as a common sense approach, as the best plan for people who live on this island, is now becoming clearer and clearer. So I think it would be an overstatement to say that Brexit will make Irish reunification happen, but I think it would be a very fair and accurate analysis to say that certainly Brexit has pushed ahead that argument, and the logic for self-government, the logic for decisions being made that affect the people of this island being taken here on this island and not in London.
So there was the Irish elections at the beginning of the year, in that pre-pandemic world, which seems like another universe, let's be honest. Sinn Féin did very well. I'm sure you were very chuffed, but you didn't stand enough candidates. So actually you would have done better. Are you like, oh, what are we like? What are you, seriously, do you regret it? Do you look back and think?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And it would take you, Owen, to put the question so bluntly, like, don't spare my feelings, whatever you do. Yeah, we should have run more candidates, absolutely. And if I had been in possession of a crystal ball, and if I could have accurately predicted what we were going to meet out on the campaign trail, and the fact that that momentum for change would just grow so strongly, yes, of course, we would have run more candidates, and we would have had more parliamentarians, more Chapta Dáil elected. But look, we still came out with the highest popular vote. We now lead the opposition. First time for Sinn Féin to lead the opposition here in Dublin. First time actually for a woman to lead the opposition at all. So there you go. It only took, 100 years. That's the make of that what you will. And best of all, I can tell you that appetite still for change, for political change beyond kind of Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael, the same old same, is very much alive and kicking. So we've a lot of work to do to prepare. We are proving to be, I think, a very effective and powerful opposition here in Dublin. But of course, we want to be in government. After the next election, I want Sinn Féin not alone to be in government, I want us to lead the next government. So we have a lot of work to do. And not least, I have to be absolutely sure that we run the right number of candidates next time.
So what's really striking is it's younger people who are disproportionately flocking to Sinn Féin. You've got a very considerable lead amongst younger voters. And that's kind of replicated a lot in terms of what's going on around the Western world. Progressive parties doing better amongst younger people, which isn't actually historically what has tended to happen. We haven't had these big generational divides, contrary to popular belief. But, you know, it's the same with Labour here. It's been the same with parties like Podemos in Spain. It's been the same with the Bernie Sanders phenomenon in the United States. So why do you think you're attracting younger people? But also, why aren't you winning over older people in the amounts you need if you want to get more support, and what you can do about it?
I just think that, you know, every ideas have their moment and their time. And I think to speak for a specific Irish context, we have come to a point now where the traditional model of politics, North and South, is now under scrutiny, and it's under pressure, but a positive pressure, and there is an appetite for change, which is undoubtedly generational. I mean, there is absolutely no doubt, not just in elections, but in key societal changes, like, for example, marriage equality or the Eighth Amendment and abortion rights, that the younger people have absolutely been the energy, the core energy that has driven that politics. But the interesting thing with generational change is it's not just the young generation who drive that change, who are part of it. That changes everybody and changes everything in a very essential way. So although Sinn Féin, you're right, attracts huge levels of support for younger people, and I'm very proud of that. I mean, that energy is essential to delivering our political project. We are actually also increasingly growing our support base in the other demographics amongst older voters as well, because we live in a small community. I mean, we're an island people. We don't have a huge population base. You know, we're quite tight knit. So when young people change things and bring that to the table, they change everybody in the process of doing it, if you understand what I mean. I think it's really interesting when I look at, again, we're island people, so we look outwardly. I think it's really interesting to see what you've described there across the continent and across the globe. And you can discern really defined, deep, you know, veins of the change that people that this generation want, and what that's going to look like, and everything from obviously the climate justice agenda, the equality and human rights agenda in terms of colour, in terms of all forms of identity, including class. And you can see a demand for an economy that serves society and not vice versa. So I actually think the whole global system, not to sound too grandiose about it, but I think there is a generational challenge, a really positive generational challenge that's coming at the political establishment right across the world. And I think it's of its time. How that will play out on this island, I believe, will be an absolute increased press for social justice, for the politics of equality, but also for the politics of reunification and democracy. These things are knitted together in the politics of Ireland. But it's a great thing. Very often, by the way, our critics and our opponents have taken to saying, well, Sinn Féin have only done well because young people don't know what they're doing, or don't know their history, or don't really know what they want. You know, incredibly condescending kind of view. But as we have grown as a political party, the political establishment that used to describe us just as a party of protest, like that's the box they put us in, now know that that's patently untrue, that we are a party that is very much about taking decisions and driving change. So we can no longer be boxed as a party of protest. So instead they look at young people and say, well, that's all right, but they don't know what they're doing. Can I tell you, Irish young people know exactly what they're doing, and they have a political roadmap, a shared roadmap amongst themselves, that they are now very actively pushing. And I think that's hugely exciting. I mean, I really think it's brought a real bounce and currency to Irish political life, because people who arguably have the most to gain and potentially the most to lose, younger people, are now active and at it and are talking politics in a way that's refreshing and challenging and brilliant, quite frankly.
After the last crash, or after the last big economic crisis, there was a lot, austerity came, cuts, not least in Ireland, and it had a terrible impact on people's living standards. Do you think that's going to happen in all over again? And what's Sinn Féin going to argue? What's the alternative Sinn Féin's going to argue when people start saying, we had to pay the huge cost, look at the deficit, and they'll start making economically illiterate comparisons with household budgets? What are you going to argue for instead?
Well, we're going to argue common sense. We're going to say, the reality is that, as with the last crisis, and now this crisis, which, bear in mind, is a public health crisis, the COVID disaster that has come into play, you're not cutting your way out of that. In fact, austerity does more damage than good, So the approach that has to be taken is an approach of investment and growth and renewal. That's what needs to happen. That's what it should have happened last time around, but it didn't. A disastrous, destructive, socially and economically destructive approach of austerity was adopted. And I think, when you reflect on it, people were only coming to terms with or getting their balance again with the real damage that had inflicted, and getting back on their feet, and then bang, COVID happens. So I think this time around, though, Owen, if you listen to the rhetoric internationally, or if you look, say, at the behaviour of the European institutions, they're actively encouraging governments to borrow, and invest, because I think this time round there is an acceptance so far, and let me emphasise so far, that cuts and austerity could do nothing other than really drive what is a crisis phase into a much more permanent crisis. So that has been resisted so far. But I have no doubt that the usual suspects at some point in time will come and make the kind of argument that you've articulated there around comparing the running of a society to, the running of a household, and the running of an economy to make a parallel to a household budget, when all of us know that those are inaccurate comparisons, and that economies borrow for good reason. The reality is it's the quality of decision making and the decisions around how you invest and where you invest and at what level you invest that actually makes the distinction between economies and societies that are prosperous and equal and fair, and economies that yo-yo up and down between boom and bust, and have sets of citizens that are protected and provided for, and then vast numbers of citizens who are left out in the cold. And we will argue all day, every day, for investment in society and in our economy to drive up productivity, to drive up prosperity, to ensure that you have appropriate and necessary distributive policies, so that you have an equal society, because equal societies are more prosperous societies, they're safer societies. And it was interesting, actually, when COVID hit, it really laid bare some of the deep scars in our society. So, for example, we have a housing issue here, as you know, Owen, on this island, particularly in Dublin, although not only in Dublin, and safe accommodation, decent accommodation has been a huge challenge here, and remains so. And then along comes COVID, and to all the naysayers who who, disregarded the argument around a person's right to shelter and accommodation. Along comes COVID and drives the point home, because COVID demonstrated without a fear of contradiction the need for a place to isolate, to self-isolate, to keep yourself out of harm's way, and so on and so forth. So for anybody who argued the toss with the left and said that we were just being nanny staters in arguing for public housing and safe accommodation and a proper set of rent controls and all of that, we have been proven right. COVID has demonstrated that what we said around the necessity for safe and appropriate accommodation was bang on, not just as a matter of a civic and a human right, but also in terms of the protection of public health now.
Just a couple of final questions. And I should say these come from the north of Ireland, because these are the sort of questions as a Brit I just feel a bit uncomfortable putting to you. But this is what we have putting in. So one, what would you say to people in the north? Oh, in terms of reassuring unionists in United Ireland. So obviously there's a unionist community up in the north. They obviously are unionists. They don't want a United Ireland. So how would you reassure them in a United Ireland?
Well, just to say, not alone do we have unionist citizens, we have citizens that are British. Do you know what I mean? And they're British today. They'll be British over Christmas and into the new year. They're British in a partitioned Ireland, and they will be British in a united Ireland. And I think it's important to stress that we're not, although we have a huge amount of preparatory work to do for an orderly constitutional transition, of that there is no doubt, we're not starting totally from ground zero, and particularly as regards issues of identity and citizenship. So the Good Friday Agreement recognises people's right to be Irish or British or both. That will prevail into a reunified Ireland. A citizen's right to carry British papers, Irish papers, and by extension European papers and passports, or both. That will prevail. And I'm offering that up, I suppose, as an example to say to people not to equate the reunification project with threat or loss. The reunification program has to be about gain and additionality. And I would say to our unionist friends, be part of this conversation. I absolutely respect the fact that unionists themselves can articulate best their needs, their ideas, their concerns around a reunified Ireland much better than I can as an Irish Republican woman. So I think we need to make space for that conversation. I think we need to acknowledge each other. I think ideally we need to appreciate each other. And just maybe to say this, and maybe this is the most reassuring thing that I can say as the leader of Sinn Féin, Irish reunification isn't just a Sinn Féin thing. Although we will campaign for it and work for it and all the rest, this is a national project, and it belongs to everybody. Everybody's view, everybody's perception, everybody's idea, everybody's vision has to go into that great melting pot. And I unlike the Taoiseach, the serving Taoiseach and the previous one here in Dublin, who would say, now is not the time, don't be talking about reunification, don't talk about the referendum on unity, don't talk about preparing. I think that's wrong-headed. I don't think that gives any comfort to anybody, including our unionist brothers and sisters, because it is self-evident that the winds of change are blowing. That's evident, that there's no sense in sticking your head in the sand. So the reassuring thing, the steadying thing, the inclusive thing to do is to plan and to have a citizens' assembly or a forum that is open to one and all to have those conversations. It's interesting, actually, Owen, recently the former leader of the DUP, Peter Robinson, has come out very clearly and has challenged what he called referendum or border poll deniers. That's how he's characterised them. You know, the bury your head in the sand brigade. That there's no comfort or reassurance for anyone in that. So I would say it's game on now. So let's talk, let's plan, let's listen to each other. Let's find perspectives. And even for those who don't want Irish reunification, for whom that's not plan A, who will go out in a referendum campaign and argue for the union, which they're more than entitled to do. That's as it is. But for all of us, including them, you have to have plans A and B and C, because ultimately the vote of the referendum, 50% plus one, is the democratic threshold. And once that's achieved, constitutional change will happen. So let's fashion that together.
Going to be fun having the Democratic Unionist Party sitting in the Irish Parliament, though, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, look, why not? I mean, listen, I mean, there was a time where if you had said that the late Martin McGuinness and Ian Paisley would be in government together, I mean, people would have said that is out there. That's crazy. It's not going to happen. But it happened. And not alone did it happen. It was, politically, a bumpy ride, but ultimately fairly successful. And those two men actually became friends. They didn't just end up in government together. They forged a friendship. So we shouldn't overstate. You have to understand difference, and you have to not be foolish or try and play it down or run away from it. But we should never, ever underestimate our capacity to adapt and our capacity to accommodate each other. And when the context changes, as is happening in Ireland now, well, then people's political perspectives and their ideas and so on change as well.
Just the final little question, which also keeps coming up. Okay. The National Health Service is something which people are very proud of. And Ireland's a bit of an outlier. It is an outlier in the Western world. As a country without a universal, free at the point of use health system for all. So what would you say to citizens in the north of Ireland who are like quite tempted by the United Ireland thing, but I don't want to lose the NHS?
I'd say no. I'd say to them, you're absolutely right. And I would say to them that the challenge for us is to build an Irish National Health Service. I mean, what we have currently in the South is, as you have described, we have a confused, two-tier and very expensive, by the way, health service. We have the highest levels of private health insurance here in this state, anywhere in the world, bar the United States of America. We spend a huge amount of money on health. By the way, our workers in the public health service and the private service are outstanding. But the model of delivery is just, it's built up in a piecemeal, inefficient and completely unequal way. And we need to change that. In the north, there is the National Health Service, which is good, but it's a health service that has been absolutely ravaged by Tory austerity. So that's what we have now. What we need to get to is an Irish National Health Service, free at the point of delivery, universal provision. That's what we need. To get there, we actually have two reform processes agreed north and south. Here in the south, it's called Sláinte care, which is, Sláinte means healthcare. So it's a reform program. It's quite good. It's cross-party endorsed. It's not quite as far as Sinn Féin would have gone, but we recognise many of the building blocks that are necessary. And then in the north, we have a process called the Bengoa approach, which actually was delivered by my colleague Michelle O'Neill when she was the Minister for Health. And again, that's a platform for reform and change. And what we need to do is marry all of that up and assess how you deliver our National Health Service, how you fund it, structurally what it looks like. And it's not all negative. We have many positive elements within the system, so it's not all gloom and doom, but we need radical change there. There's no doubt. I'm not asking anybody to be part of a reunified Ireland that still has an inefficient, expensive health system where you have to pay €60 or more to see your GP, where you're left endlessly on waiting lists. I don't want that. That's not acceptable to me or my family, and I don't want it for anyone else. So, and I absolutely, by the way, understand, Owen, that when people are talking about Irish reunification, that, you know, it's not necessarily the issues of identity or flags or anthems, although those are important and sensitive. It is actually the issue of healthcare that most immediately grabs people. So we need to plan for that. And I don't want the healthcare system that we currently have here. So I would say to them, I'm with you, and I'll fight for that National Health Service for you and your family, and for me and for mine.
So very final question, little pithy response. How far away is United Ireland?
We'll do it in the next decade. We'll do it in this decade, actually. This is the decade of opportunity. I was saying that we've no Ardèche, we've no party conference this year, Owen, sadly, but the last time we met was November 2019, and I set it out there in my speech to our party delegates. And I believe that we can have our referendum, win it, and win it well in the course of this decade. And it's my job as the leader of Sinn Féin, with my colleagues and with wider society, to navigate us to that certain and safe shore.
Wow. United Ireland within a decade. That's big. You hit it here, everyone.
Heard it here first. As ever, Owen Jones with the breaking news.
Exclusive. Thank you so much, Lou McDonald. That was absolutely fantastic, and it was a pleasure to have you on as ever. We'll do this as our annual. It's becoming an event.
Yeah. And do you know the amazing thing is, I year on year I can see myself aging, but you're like Dorian Gray. You know, you obviously, I don't know what you're doing, but it's working.
Socialism is a great skincare routine. I stand by that. But also, there is someone in the attic. But it's a huge pleasure, and I will speak to you soon. But thank you for the interview.
Thank you so much.